Right now, someone's phone is buzzing with the worst news of their life. A parent, a partner, a friend. And in about seconds, the world they woke up in this morning will no longer exist. When that happens, and it will happen to every single person watching this, the first question that hits isn't philosophical. It's animal. It's the question you ask at 3 a.m. when the house is too quiet and your chest feels too tight. What actually happens when we die? Humanity has been answering this for thousands of years, and we've basically settled on two options. Option 1. Your soul leaves your body and goes somewhere. Heaven, hell, reincarnation. Pick your tradition. Option 2. Nothing. Lights off. Blackout. You were here, and then you simply aren't. But there's a third answer almost nobody talks about. One that isn't, there's a heaven, and isn't, there's nothing. An answer so unsettling that the man who figured it out was permanently expelled from his community, cursed in a ceremony so severe they forbade anyone from standing within 6 feet of him, and his books were banned across Europe for over a century. His name was Baruch Spinoza, Jewish philosopher, 17th century, Amsterdam. Ground optical lenses by day, wrote philosophy by candlelight at night. Lived on soup, beer, and tobacco. When the University of Heidelberg offered him a prestigious professorship, he turned it down, said it would compromise his freedom to think. Not exactly a career move. He chose poverty and glass dust over prestige and comfort. He died at 44 from lung disease, almost certainly from inhaling that glass dust for years. The man who spent his life helping people see more clearly was killed by the tools of his own trade. But the idea he left behind didn't die with him. It couldn't. To understand what Spinoza saw, you first need to understand the deal. From childhood, most of us received some version of this. Be good, follow the rules, and when you die, you'll be rewarded. Break the rules, and there are consequences. It's clean, it's structured. And in the hardest moments of life, standing at a graveside, or watching a 5-year-old at a funeral tug on her mother's sleeve and ask, "Where did Grandpa go?" The answer, "He's in a better place," does something no philosophy can. It holds people together when they're falling apart. That's real. That matters. But Spinoza noticed something about this arrangement that most people never stop to examine. If the entire point of your life is to earn a spot in the next one, then you're not really living. You're performing. Every act of kindness isn't really kindness, it's strategy. You're not loving people because you love them. You're loving people because you're worried about what happens if you don't. That's not freedom. That's an audition. And the whole system depends on one assumption, that there's a somewhere else, a backstage, a place the show is actually for. Spinoza looked at that assumption and said, there is no somewhere else. This is it. This, right here, right now, is the whole thing. That would already be radical enough. Except Spinoza went further. And this is where it becomes dangerous. Spinoza didn't just reject the afterlife. He redefined God. He had a phrase, 3 words in Latin, that quietly detonated 2,000 years of religious thinking. Deus sive natura. It means God or nature. Your first instinct might be, oh, so God is in the trees and the sunset. Sounds nice. Also wrong. That's the polite version. That's not what he meant. What Spinoza actually said was far stranger. God doesn't live inside nature. God is nature. The whole thing, every law of physics, every chemical reaction, every galaxy spinning, and every cell dividing. The neurons firing in your brain right now as you process this sentence, that's God, doing what God does. There's no God and a universe. There's one reality, one substance, expressing itself in infinite ways. Let that land for a second. If God is everything, then there is no elsewhere for God to be. No separate realm. No heaven above the clouds. No backstage. Spinoza basically wrote a math textbook about God, axioms, proofs, theorems, the whole thing, which is either the most arrogant or the most humble thing anyone has ever done. The book wasn't published in his lifetime. He knew what would happen. When it finally came out after his death, it was banned almost immediately. For over a century, Spinozism was basically a slur, a polite way of calling someone a dangerous heretic. But the logic was already out, and logic doesn't care about bans. Now think about what this does to death. If everything is one substance, one infinite, eternal reality expressing itself in temporary forms, then you are not a separate thing that was created and will be destroyed. You are a pattern, a specific, temporary arrangement of the same stuff that makes up everything else. Spinoza compared it to a wave in the ocean. The wave rises. It has a shape, a direction, a kind of identity. And then it breaks. But the water doesn't disappear. It was ocean before the wave formed. It's ocean after the wave dissolves. The wave was never separate from the water. It was the water, doing something temporary. That's you. When you die, the atoms that built your hands, your eyes, your brain, they become part of something else. Soil, air, eventually new life. The universe doesn't lose a single atom when you die. Nothing is subtracted. The substance continues. The form changes. This is where the comforting version breaks down. Because if you're honest, that sounds like a consolation prize. Your atoms get recycled. Great. Not exactly what people are hoping to hear at a funeral. And here's the part most people never follow to the end. Spinoza believed the mind contains something eternal. Not your personality, not your memories, not your ego. That anxious narrator constantly whispering, "I need this, and I'm afraid of that." Something underneath all of that. He called it intuitive knowledge. Not information, not facts you memorized for a test. The moments when you actually understand something, when you see how things connect, when a pattern clicks, and suddenly the world makes a little more sense. That understanding, Spinoza said, participates in eternity, because truth doesn't expire. 2 + 2 = 4 before you were born. It'll equal 4 long after. Stay with me here, because this is the part that costs something. Think of it like a campfire. The log burns. It's gone. You can't put it back together. But the heat it threw off, the warmth that changed every person sitting around it, the conversations it made possible, the way it rearranged the evening, that doesn't vanish. It became part of what happened. Permanently. Every real insight you've ever had works the same way. Every moment of genuine love that rewired how you see another person. Every time you created something, a sentence, a meal, a solution, a connection, that captured a real piece of how things actually work. That doesn't vanish when your heart stops. It continues in the people you changed, in the ideas you shaped, in the marks you left on the structure of things. You're not immortal the way religions promise, but you're not nothing. You're a thread in something that doesn't stop being woven. And this is where it stops being philosophy and starts being personal. Spinoza said something deceptively simple. A free person thinks of nothing less than death, and their wisdom is a meditation not on death, but on life. What he meant is that fear of death is the single biggest thief of actual living. When you're afraid of the end, you make small decisions. You cling to things that don't matter. You stay in the job you hate, the relationship that's already over, the version of yourself you outgrew years ago, because change feels like a small death, and you've been trained to fear all death. The dread that catches you at 3 a.m., Spinoza would say it doesn't come from death itself. It comes from clinging to the idea of I as something separate. That little fortress you've built. I am this person. I hold this role. I own these things. When the fortress feels threatened, panic sets in. But the fortress was always an illusion. You were never separate. You were always part of the whole thing. When you feel that, not just think it, but feel it the way you feel cold air or sudden good news, something loosens. Spinoza wasn't naive. He didn't promise the fear disappears overnight, but it loosens its grip, and in that loosening, there's room to actually be alive. He had a word for this drive: conatus, the effort every natural thing makes to persist in its being, to fully express what it is. A seed doesn't become a tree because someone ordered it to. A river doesn't reach the sea out of obedience. They do what they do because that's what they are. It's not willpower. It's not discipline. It's nature expressing itself. A human being, a thinking, feeling, conscious creature, naturally pushes toward understanding and connection. That's not a commandment from above. It's your design. Happiness, for Spinoza, isn't a reward you collect at the end. It's what happens when you stop fighting what you are and start becoming more of it. Here's what catches people off guard. In 1929, a reporter asked Einstein if he believed in God. His answer: "I believe in Spinoza's God. Not a God who judges and punishes. The God that is the order of everything that exists." Spinoza didn't destroy the sacred. He just removed the part that needs you to be afraid. And what's left, stripped of the threats, the bribes, the cosmic surveillance, it turns out, is what the deepest voices in every tradition were pointing at all along. So forget the philosophy for a second. What actually changes tomorrow morning if this is true? Grief doesn't disappear, but it transforms. The people you've lost didn't vanish into a void. Everything they understood, every way they changed the people around them, every genuine connection, that's still here. Not in some other dimension. Here, in the fabric. Like the campfire, the log is gone, but the heat reshaped everything it touched. Regret fades, not because you stop caring, but because you stop measuring your life against a scorecard that doesn't exist. There's no cosmic performance review, no final tally of sins and virtues. There's only one question: did you become more of what you actually are? Ambition changes. You stop chasing things to fill a void or earn approval from a judge who isn't there. You start doing things because they're aligned with what you actually are. That shift is enormous. It's the difference between running from something and walking towards something. And maybe most importantly, Tuesday morning changes. You're in the grocery store, fluorescent lights, bad music. Your hands are cold from the produce aisle. And for no particular reason, you notice the way light hits the avocados, and you think about photosynthesis, and you realize that the energy in those cells traveled 93 million miles from a star, and the same process is happening inside your retina right now, and you and the avocado are expressions of the same system. For about 4 seconds, you feel it, not as a thought, but as a fact. Connected. Part of something that doesn't end. That's what Spinoza called the intellectual love of God, available in a grocery store on a Tuesday. Heaven and hell aren't places you go when you die. Heaven is those 4 seconds. Hell is spending your whole life never having them, scrolling past your own existence, too busy auditioning for the afterlife to notice the life you already have. A lens grinder figured this out in a rented room 350 years ago. They cursed him for it, banned his books, tried to erase his name. The idea survived anyway. You have a life, a short one, unrepeatable, made of the same substance as everything else that has ever existed or will ever exist. The only question is, will you spend it auditioning or actually living?